Washington added a defensive tackle and suffered some tough losses on the recruiting trail on Friday.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into a special Friday edition that's coming to you later than usual of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's a site editor with Athlon Sports Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen today, hopefully, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make it more as playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, Lars, we are coming at the everydayers a lot later than we normally do with our last show of the week. And we do apologize for the lateness of this episode. But the first thing right off the top, when you're covering recruiting, it's not our place to announce where these kids are going to college. So we wanted to make sure we gave them some time to actually announce. And in one case, there was a late flip and we thought one thing was going to happen. We'll get to that in a little bit, and something else happened. But let's start on the positive side. Let's start with Washington's one addition from the day, and that's three-star defensive tackle Caleb Smith out of Birmingham, Alabama. And Lars, I can't remember the last time Washington had somebody from Alabama on this team.
I think the last time they recruited somebody from the state of Alabama was Reuben Foster. Back in the day, back in the day. And that process of recovering that recruitment was just as bizarre because there was a lot going on back then. But this recruit, Caleb Smith, a very interesting prospect because he, as we talked about, I believe a couple months ago on the show before he came up for his official visit on June 21st, that he does play a little bit out of position. Washington went down in January with John Richardson, cornerbacks coach, and Armand Hawkins, the assistant director of recruiting, and offered three players at his high school: Smith, Jordan Crawford, and Adeem Oford. Yeah. And so obviously at the time, Crawford was committed to Auburn, has stayed there. But that, I think, showed Washington was able to say, hey, you know what? We like all of you guys. Smith, though, does play a little bit out of position at Parker High School as an edge. We both see him more of an interior guy, at least maybe a potential three technique. Somebody who he has the size at 6'5", 252, set an edge. But when you look at his tape, again, there's a lot to like. But one thing you do initially see is, wow, that guy really probably should just move over like a foot and a half, and he can be so much more disruptive. And I think that's kind of the plan for him.
I know I've said this before. I don't really like doing player comps with a lot of these guys, but I have sort of a deployment comp that I've got here. And it's somebody who we haven't yet seen in a Washington uniform, but will this fall. And let's see where I'm going with it. Where I think that he could be utilized a lot like Deshaun Lynch, where Sacramento State transfer at 6'5", 283 is somebody we're going to see set the edge a lot. We're going to see him move inside on passing downs, where I have a feeling that we're going to see Smith a little bit more just on the interior when it's all said and done, when he does end up getting on the field, whenever that might be. But he's somebody who I think has the power and the strength to set the edge. I'd like to see a little bit more out of him as a pass rusher. But as you said, there's not necessarily always that opportunity for him to do so, just in terms of just the way his defensive line runs and different things like that. But I think that that's kind of the role that Washington's coaching staff has in mind. And on a defensive line where you're taking a lot of projectable guys, this is one that you like in that same mold. And it's something where if you really do want to continue to try to go hard and establish this national footprint, getting a guy from Alabama is a nice way to continue that. You know, if he has some success a year, 2 years down the line, whatever it might be, that's a nice thing to go out and sell as you continue to try to push into Florida. You try to push deeper into Texas. You try to do all these different things in different parts of the country. You got a guy from Illinois, right? Like, the more you start to look around this roster, and if you're trying to do that, Caleb Smith is a really good way to try to just continue to sell that.
And anytime, and people will say, oh, well, it's a 3-star. Who did he have offers from? That's the other side of this equation. He was considering Purdue, was considering Michigan State. There was a couple of other big, Power 4 schools that he was looking at. I believe had an offer from Arkansas and Oklahoma State, among others. So it wasn't just, oh, this is a good, middle of the road Southeast prospect who doesn't have any other prospects besides Washington. No, this is the guy that other schools identified. So I think that's worth considering. And in your same vein of a future projection comp, this is not an on the field comp, but in a way a recruiting comp. When Washington got Levi Onwuzurike out of Texas, you never really saw a ton of Texas guys. You did see a couple guys, previously coming out of Texas before Levi, but that was a guy where you could see on the defensive side, oh, wow, defensive guys that are passed over by TCU, Texas, Texas Tech, all these other big prominent schools. For Caleb Smith's case, Auburn and Alabama. Okay, that they don't want him, but other Power 4 schools do. Let's establish that. And so we can say in a couple of classes where we've seen Washington offer 26 guys in Alabama, some 27s on the East Coast. You can see these defensive prospects 2 or 3 years. And when we look at Caleb Smith making an impact in 2 deeps, if that's the case, that's a massive selling point to say, oh, wow, these guys can actually go all the way up to Seattle. They're in the Big Ten, so you're not on some pack. I love Yogi Roth and Ashley Adamson and everybody with the Pac-12 network, but just that whole other side of that operation did not work out. They weren't able to get seen as much. So now that you're in the Big Ten, you don't have the visibility issue. And I think when all is said and done, if Caleb Smith is able to actually, continue to develop, because again, by no stretch of the imagination to see a finished product, and moving inside, I think will also help in that regard. But if he's able to crack the 2 deeps as a sophomore, or maybe even be a rotational piece as a sophomore and a junior, you're looking at some of those guys in the 26 and 27 class that could say, hey, Caleb Smith laid the foundation for me to actually believe that I could end up at Washington and have success and still make it to the NFL. That's what all these guys want to do. And so when you have to go and get some of these guys from the East Coast or from the Midwest or just outside the traditional Washington footprint, you also have to hope on the back end that you can still develop those guys, because if you get a kid from, let's say, North Carolina or, Florida or Mississippi, and he doesn't work out, there's not really a pipeline there. You don't really get to establish anything. So it's a twofold argument, but I do think Caleb Smith is the perfect guy to open that door because he has so much predictability down the road.
So I absolutely agree with you there, but we're going to just keep right on rolling here and get into some of the tough losses that Washington did suffer. Just naming them off here really quick. 5-star cornerback Dijon Lee chooses Alabama. 3, 4-star, depending on where you look. Defensive tackle Josiah Sharma chooses Oregon. And then 3-star offensive lineman Darius Afalava chooses Oklahoma. Lars, let's start with Darius Afalava. We'll get to the other guys on the other side of the break. But I kind of alluded to it in the beginning. We had heard for a while that it seemed like it was going to be Washington for Afalava. Then a couple hours before his set commitment time, those crystal balls start rolling in, and it's Oklahoma. This is a really interesting one.
Yeah, and I don't want to insinuate that I knew that this was coming, but I do want to just state for the record, when I talked to Afalava before his official visit to Washington, after he had taken the official to Oklahoma on June 7th, he did say that Oklahoma made up a significant – he went out of his way to say that Oklahoma made up a significant amount of ground in his recruitment. That was still going into the Washington visit where we thought, okay, well, Oklahoma might then finish second, and that's a good consideration for Washington. But I do think there also was an element to where he did mention the Oklahoma pedigree of offensive linemen, and it's something Garrett Hatchett. I know Washington fans won't like that, but when he transferred to Oklahoma, there's just a different O-line pedigree that not necessarily Brendan Carroll doesn't have, but it's a different beast than when you have the opportunity with Oklahoma playing in the SEC. We've seen Washington offer a couple of other guys along the offensive line, which we'll talk about later. So it's not necessarily that we didn't want him. It's just, sometimes you got to tip your hat to some other schools. Brent Venables did a great job closing on him when he was on his visit. He had a relationship with him, the offensive line coach as well. It is absolutely a loss. But I don't necessarily think, given that you have Champ Talele, you have Jake Flores, you have a couple other guys in the class that you're looking at, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a stinger because this was a guy that, for all intents and purposes, we thought was one of those 10 emojis that Jedd Fisch tweeted out last weekend.
Right. Absolutely. Got more on the other side of the break. Right after a message from our good friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors is everything to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. All the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. So, Lars, let's move on to Josiah Sharma, because this is a really interesting one another one where, I hate talking about the crystal balls, but, let's go back to the beginning first, where committed to Washington on the morning of the Sugar Bowl, decommits following Kalen DeBoer's departure for Alabama. And Alabama was in the mix for him again. Came down to Alabama, Texas, Oregon, and Washington. And those crystal balls were rolling in for Texas last night. And then all of a sudden, they flipped to Oregon a couple hours before he's set to announce. That one, we're not going to insinuate things, but we know what Phil Knight wants to do in these next couple of years. So I think that one is somewhat self-explanatory, but this is, of the three that I'm looking at here, this one is the biggest blow in my opinion. And it's not just because it's Oregon. It's not just because of those things. It's because he was the highest ranked defensive tackle on the West Coast by a landslide. And we look at a guy like Dominic McCone, who you and I really like, and you look at some of the other guys that Washington has along the defensive line in this class, now with Caleb Smith and a couple of these other guys. They're really nice, promising pieces. And that's the same thing you can say about Sharma, but it's just kind of, and it's something we've discussed for a while. I'm trying to find the right words here, because defensive tackle was kind of a barren wasteland for the most part on the West Coast this year. When you look at where the top guys were ranked, and just with Sharma being the top defensive tackle on the West Coast, and he's number 41 in the class, like that's a whole other conversation. But you want to make sure that you can try to close in some of those top guys. And this is one where it's, there's certainly things he needs to work on. He's still a very raw, projectable player, but letting a guy like that go to Oregon is something where it's tougher in the sense of, how do I put this? It's tougher in the sense of Oregon has been loading up on these defensive tackles year in and year out, which is such an important part of playing in the Big Ten. And that's something that Washington needs to do. Washington needs to find a way to get some of these guys. And with the position Jedd Fisch and his coaching staff were put in this year, that's really difficult. And this was the one guy where it felt like, all right, if you want to start making just that headway and starting to really load up that position and be disruptive at that position in the Big Ten, whether it be next year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, that Sharma was the guy who really could have started that. And I mean that as no disrespect to Dominic McCone, who I think could be just as talented of a player. I truly do. Just from watching his film, the way he plays, his motor, those sort of things. But you want to be able to stack those classes. And those are some of the things, just getting that highly ranked guy that will, put you on that national map, that national perspective, which is something that Washington could certainly use a boost in at times.
Yeah, I mean, what you're hitting at is there's levels to this. Dan Lanning is a couple levels ahead because he, in fairness, started a couple levels ahead a couple of years ago. This is not something where Jedd Fisch could be expected to have the same level of production in year one and they're on the recruiting trail because, didn't show that at Arizona. I know it was a different situation taking over a 1-10 team, all things considered. But even in year two, Jedd still was getting, a mix of 3 and 4 stars. He wasn't necessarily in play for consensus 4 stars on a month in, month out basis. And it's not to say that he couldn't be in a couple of years at Washington, because as we said, Washington, Arizona resources aren't even comparable at this point. In a way, Oregon is also still, they have so many other resources that, again, we can get into, we can not get into, that do make it a little more difficult in that regard. But there is a way, and I think so. I completely agree with you that it's a tough pill to swallow. I think more so because knowing that Washington and Oregon are both going into the Big Ten, and you're thinking, well, now we have our new annual rivalry, and it's Oregon, and Oregon's out recruiting us. Well, they kind of started ahead. I think for me, it's more Dijon Lee, and I don't mean to rhyme that unintentionally, but when you think about the three, they had way more of a head start with Dijon Lee with the relationship that John Richardson had with him in Arizona, Armand Hawkins. There was a number of different guys that he had already known at Arizona, and that's what allowed Washington to make his Final Four with other heavy hitters. The other problem with that was the guy that Jedd Fisch was replacing also had a very good relationship with Dijon Lee, and so did Courtney Morgan. And Courtney Morgan being the general manager down in Alabama with Kalen Moore now, it wasn't a surprise when Dijon Lee picked. But for me, that was a bigger loss just because of the three. There was without question. I mean, I know Sharma did commit to what was set to commit and all that, but more so that was for the previous staff than it was for the school. And I'm not saying this isn't a school staff debate, but of the three a couple of months ago, let's say back in January, which of the three would you have picked to commit to Washington? It would have been Dijon Lee, just because absolutely. Of the relationships and everything involved. And when you look at the class that they have, Larue Zamorano is going to be good. And if he ends up at Washington, we'll talk about him later on as well. But that was a guy where, similar to what you're talking about with the defensive line, if you can get a 4 or 5 star guy, one of the premier players at his position, and you already have that relationship ahead of time, to me, that's just the toughest pill to swallow. But at the same point, there are levels to this. As I said, in Alabama, year in and year out is levels, and maybe not as many levels as they used to be for different reasons, with Kalen DeBoer there, Nick Saban gone, all that sort of thing. But there is a different cachet, a different overall aura that Alabama has that some recruits are just naturally drawn to. But if you're Washington, you can still keep your hat in the ring and potentially try and flip him before signing him.
So I agree with you there, and I'm glad you added that there in the end. But the reason that Dijon Lee wasn't my choice here was because I started swallowing that pill a month ago. Like that's probably the best way to put it. Where you start taking the other visits, it's Georgia, it's Bama, right? And it's, as you said, it's that relationship that he had with Courtney Morgan, with Kalen DeBoer, with that coaching staff that kept Washington in the running for him for so long. It was all those same things. And you and I were talking before the show, just to pull the curtain back here a whole bunch. We said if Kalen DeBoer was still here, are we having a different conversation? We're not going to go down that road. But I just want to say that's something that people are certainly going to think about. That's something that you have to keep in mind here. But that was something where, even when Dijon Lee rescheduled his visit, where he was going to give Washington the last visit, and then all of a sudden, no, I'm giving Bama the last visit. That was the first time I was like, oh, that seems like, it might end up being Bama. But there are some things along those lines where I think I certainly agree with you. I'm sure, this is when Georgia is going to continue to push for him. Texas A&M, Washington, all the schools that are still in his top 4, his top 5 are going to continue to push for him. But I certainly agree with you, especially for a guy of his caliber, as you said, who could come in and start next year, basically wherever he's going to go, no matter if it is the SEC, if it is the Big Ten, where he has that ability. So I certainly agree with you there. And I want to mention one other name that you said there as we kind of just continue to move on here. And that's Larue Zamorano. That's a guy who's got some Washington crystal balls. Wouldn't be surprised if he does end up joining the fold here at some point soon. Just in terms of reading the tea leaves, that sort of stuff at this point in time, where I think that would be a really nice addition to the class. And this could still end up being a really nice defensive backs class, where you'll look at Rylon Dillard-Allen potentially joining the fold as well. You get a couple of other guys in there and you could end up being really, really happy. But I like where you're going with that with Dijon Lee. Is still certainly you wish you had that guy as the headliner.
And I will just say for the everydayers, if you check out Vinny Sinceri's story on Instagram today, just highly encourage you to do that.
On Friday, yeah.
Cooking, that's all I'll say. On Friday, yeah. Paisan is cooking, that's all I'll say, because there's another 4-star that he posted a photo with in his story that I think, again, for whatever this class is right now, I do want to stress to Washington fans, there's still 5 or 6 months left until signing day for some of these guys, and if not, even February. But let's just caveat it at 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
If Washington starts out 4-2, 5-1 in the Big Ten, again, the schedule sets up pretty easily to do that. Then some of these recruits might start to circle back. And this is where, these relationships and being involved early on, taking those big swings early on. And if you happen to miss, like on a Sharma or on a Lee, you're not necessarily missing. It's almost like, okay, now these are the official leaders. These are the official leaders in the clubhouse for these schools. But none of these guys are signed. So it doesn't really matter until November, December, because would you be surprised if Dijon Lee makes an unofficial visit for the Washington-Oregon game in November? If Washington's, 7-3, somewhere in that ballpark and competitive. And maybe Alabama's had a couple of surprising losses with Kalen DeBoer as the new coach. I'm not insinuating anything in that regard, but that's why maintaining those relationships, not burning those bridges, which again, we're not saying these guys are doing that, but I just want to stress that all these relationships don't just go out the window on July or June 28th because these guys are committing elsewhere. It's again, he could also go to the portal and maybe he doesn't play for Alabama. We've seen a number of guys go and transfer out. That's why everything in the modern age of college football comes back to relationships and recruiting. Clearly, Washington has the staff to do that. They just haven't had the time on campus to show exactly what they can do at Washington. Even though they did at Arizona, it's still different at Washington.
Sure. Lars, we got some more of these other guys that are still on the board right after the break. Because we're going to send a message to our good friends over at FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games. The sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And I'm going to go back to that same fun little parlay I gave the Everydays the other day that I may or may not have gotten some of my own skin in the game while I was out there on the East Coast. And Paul Skeens for National League Rookie of the Year and Ceddanne Rafaela for American League Rookie of the Year. I think that's a really fun combination of guys who've been really, really good early on. You might be getting some decent numbers there as well. So, Lars, let's jump over to the offensive line because we talked about the defensive line. There's 4 guys committed there. I don't think from what you and I have looked at, there doesn't seem to be anything else imminent. CJ May has got his commitment in a couple of weeks, but that's a true edge rusher. And that's something we'll discuss on a later show. So I think that's more worth it to spend some time on the offensive line where there are 2 outstanding targets right now. The first one, who's got a commitment date set for July 2nd, is one of my favorite players in this class, 6'8", 370 pounds, Elijah Vaikona from Santa Margarita Catholic. And this is a guy who, this is not a prediction, but if Washington does beat out USC and UCLA for his commitment on July 2nd, I'm not going to be that mad about Darius Afalava choosing Oklahoma.
No, and to be clear, Darius, every school saw him as an offensive guard. Vaikona, absolutely, without question, 12 out of 10, absolute unit coming off the bus as an offensive tackle. To be very clear, this is not we're taking. Just because you said that, I want to be clear that, and I do think because I got the chance to watch him at the Under Armour Next camp in April down in Tacoma. Obviously, he still has a ways to improve on the field. Was kind of a late riser in the process. I know a lot of USC reporters, Mark Culkin, Scott Schrader, both great friends of the program. When USC was classifying him as a rising prospect, I'm like, well, Washington did notice him a while back. So it's not he's continuing to rise, anything like that. But I do think coming from Santa Margarita Catholic, a good high school in Southern California, this is a prospect where, yeah, he might not – I know you love Justin Hilcomb, but he might not be that kind of guy where he might be able to crack the 2 deeps as a freshman. But certainly after he gets a year in the program, redshirt, get a little more technical work with Brendan Carroll and the offensive line staff on his game, I think this is an absolute guy who could be a 2 or 3 year starter once he kind of fully grows into the game, grows into his own, because the frame, you cannot replace that. You cannot – those bodies, we talk about, the trenches being kind of down on the West Coast. Yeah, they might be down, but anytime you can get a body like this, you absolutely have to push the chips into the table to get him.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so high on him is just you watch his film, you look at his frame, and you see somebody who he's transferring to Santa Margarita this year. Like this will be his first year with the program. And you can tell that at some of his previous stops, he just hasn't been coached and he hasn't learned how to use his body yet, which for somebody of his size, yeah, that makes sense. That happens. That happens a lot. It is what it is, right? So that's something where when I watch him, I just see just worlds of potential. I see worlds of natural power. I see everything that I like your comparison to Justin Hilkema there, where there are certainly things that we really like about Justin's film. And there's certainly things that he still needs to improve on, like every high school offensive line prospect does. So I like where you're going with that. And just the more I watch Elijah, the more I just see what he could be under Brendan Carroll, or really under any just offensive line coach who's worth his contract in college football, because that's just the perfect prospect that you want, where if you get where he already moves really well. And if you just get him to unlock his power and you get him to play with decent technique and mirror edge rushers and learn counters and use his hands well and things like that, this is a guy who's going to be impossible to get around because he's bigger than every single defensive tackle, let alone edge rusher. Or I think that's a lot of fun. And I could go on about him for so much longer, but I want to get to the other guy on the board. And that's Kennedy Catholic prospect, Lowen Colman-Brusa, who's another guy that I really love his film. And I think this is somebody who you and I have talked about him before. His younger brother, Derek, is the number one prospect in the state of Washington in the 2026 class. But offering him goes so far beyond that, where he's somebody who is a really nice athlete at the position and already has decent technique. And if he can add a little bit of weight and just add some extra strength, our good buddy Ben Glassmeyer wrote about him over on Huskies Wire. He could be a really nice option as a swing tackle.
Exactly. And I know this is one thing that we always talk about on the show, where he's an in-state prospect. So is this a potential down the road guy? Is his brother? I do honestly think, even without his brother, this is a take. I just want to make that clear. This is somebody where, yes, is he a finished product? Is he a finished product? Absolutely not. But when you look at what Washington's been able to do under these staffs, but just Washington offensive linemen in general, there's sometimes guys that go underrated, undernoticed, and end up popping 2 or 3 years later. Where think about, I know it's not exactly a like for like comp, but the Oregon State offensive lineman who went in the first round this past year didn't really have an interest in Washington because now again, I know this is a tackle versus guard thing, but when you look at that class where it was Roger Rosengard, it was a bunch of 4-stars. That's why sometimes letting those guys sneak out of the state does come back to bite you. Now, again, didn't come back to bite Washington because you just had the Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. So without question, I'm not saying that Scott Huff missed in that regard. But this is also kind of a hallmark of Brendan Carroll's and Jedd Fisch where, hey, we'll take some of these under the radar guys because we know how to coach and develop them. And I know there's 2 buzzwords that people always hate. And it's, well, why can't you coach up 4 and 5 stars? It's, well, there's also other layers that go with recruiting 4 and 5 stars that don't necessarily come with recruiting 3 stars. And that's not to say that you take a bunch of 3 stars and say, you know what, we're not going to spend any NIL, or we're not going to do anything, or we're just going to be the old fashioned, 1980s college football where we just take all the walk-ons from the state and turn them into, 3-star lettermen years down the road. No, it's not ever going to be the case in 2024 moving forward. But you do need to have some of those guys where we see Victor Sanchez-Hernandez on the other side of the ball. Is he a guy that would play as a freshman or redshirt freshman? Probably not. But by a sophomore, junior year, could he be a starter? Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what you want, especially when you look at the bodies of the offensive line. How do they project out over the next couple of years? You can develop for a couple of years. And once you get and that's honestly better for kids because you'd rather have them get the right body and then play versus play and then kind of figure the body out and strengthen that, because that can really mess up an offensive lineman's technique. We've seen not a lot, but a number of offensive linemen kind of struggle and regress, not just at Washington, but across college football, because they kind of got thrust in a little earlier than they probably should have.
No, I completely agree with you there. So Lars, just real quickly before we get out of here, let's talk about some potential good news. There's been a lot of just tough topics to discuss on this show, where there are 2 4-star prospects that Washington is firmly in the mix for that are committing on Monday. The first one is the number 1 prospect in the state of Washington, Zaydrius Rainey-Sale. We're just going to spend 60 seconds on each of these guys and try to get out of here with a little bit of positivity, where I don't know about you, but I feel really good about the possibility of Zaydrius choosing Washington again as of this moment, where it's down to UW, Florida State, and UCLA. And I just think that the allure of staying home, and just with all the momentum that Washington picked up over the last week, where he was on his official visit, and the other 3 members of that visit weekend that were from the state of Washington all committed. That's really nice, and that's the momentum that you want to see, especially if you're a guy like that.
Yeah, and to have a call back to earlier in the show, it's a reverse Dijon Lee, where he scheduled an earlier official visit to Washington and then rescheduled it for the last visit weekend. And that, again, was kind of a sense where we both had felt he was going to end up at Washington, but that really did seem to drive home. And again, I know that Afalava ended his last visit and didn't end up choosing Washington, but more often than not, guys that end up making their last visit usually use that school. It's not a guarantee, but I think it would be a pretty safe bet to put some future fan laws in that way.
I agree with you there. And then let's get to the other one, and that's 4-star edge rusher defensive lineman Smith Orogbo, where this is the only other guy really where this is kind of why we saved him for the end, where we'll see what happens. I'm not fully convinced that Washington's out of the mix for him yet, where it feels like, he's probably going to stay in the South. So they're finalists for Texas, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma. But this is a guy where if you can find a way to get him, man, that's a huge pull.
Yeah, to me, this seems like a Texas Tech. I know he took a visit to Texas. I just don't know necessarily where he stands with them. But yeah, given again, he still, I don't know if he still has it, but that Belichick-esque profile photo on Instagram has got to represent something. I'm not saying, again, I'm not somebody who says, hey, like just because the kid wears gloves, meaning he's going to that school. But I do think, in a similar light to some of these other guys that we talked about, like a Rain Weinsberg where he's in Florida, there's a chance where you can go put on for the state of Texas and be a 4-star and develop a Washington. And I think given all the other guys that they've taken, Smith Orogbo could be that perfect cherry on top where we talked about, Victor Sanchez-Hernandez being a long-term development prospect who could still play relatively early, but you really got to add a couple 4-stars into this class. And I could see Smith Orogbo doing it. Chace Sims is still at the 3-star. So there's some guys that are on the board. We're just not necessarily. The good indication for Washington, I never got to get out of here, is that it doesn't necessarily seem like he's a lock one way or another to go to X school. He's not a lock to go to Texas Tech. He's not a lock to go to Texas. I don't know if he visited A&M, but let's just say he's not a lock to go to A&M either. So, and nor is he a lock to go to Washington. But the fact that you haven't been given any indication that you're not, some of these kids are good at keeping secrets. So Jonathan Epperson told me, he's like, yeah, I told my little sisters a couple of weeks before I committed, and they're pretty good at keeping secrets. So I had to tell somebody. And so who knows? Maybe his dad knows, maybe his cousin knows, and the world just gets to find out whenever he announces.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you all the everydayers for tuning in and bearing with us on this Friday afternoon. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. And, we hope that, with some other fun stuff coming, stay tuned. Make sure that you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, because we're going to have some special bonus content coming up. And you can do that wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. Updating the channel 3 times a week with new content, plus special bonus episodes. Keep an eye out for some of those. We might be dropping one pretty soon. You never know. That's why you got to click that bell so you get notified every time we post a new video. Comment down below if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that. If you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Monday.